Chapter 11, Sun Hee. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, things seemed to change very quickly. More Japanese soldiers appeared in the streets, and the government immediately made dozens of new laws. One of them was the law about neighborhood associations. The Japanese wanted us to gather quickly in case there was ever a war emergency. They organized the associations to teach us how to do this. In each neighborhood, one person was named the block leader. The Japanese officials would give information to the block leader, who used a megaphone to call everyone from their homes. We had to drop whatever we were doing and hurry out into the street. Everyone stood in line. The block leader pointed to the first family, the head of the household, usually the father, and called out 1 at the top of his lungs, then 2 from the next family, and so on down the line until the leader had heard the number 10. There were 10 households in every association. Then the leader would make whatever announcement the Japanese wanted him to make over the megaphone. One of our neighbors was an old woman named Mrs. Han. She had a very unfortunate life. Her husband had divorced her, and she returned home to live with her parents. They had died within a few years of each other. Now she was all alone in the world. She was the only divorced person I'd ever met. People in the neighborhood avoided her. They said that she was bad luck. I didn't think that was true. She seemed pretty much like everybody else. All the same, I didn't like visiting her house. It always seemed empty and forlorn, as if the air inside were never warmed by laughter. Amani felt sorry for Mrs. An. We usually stopped by her house on our way to the market to ask if she needed everything. And whenever there was a call over the megaphone for a neighborhood association meeting, Amani rushed over to the door to help her. At this very first accounting, we didn't know what to do. The leader had to shout over and over to get us to form a line by household. It was only Amoni and me at home that day. The men were all somewhere else. Soldiers walked up and down the street, pounding on doors and making sure everyone was out of their houses. Then they watched sternly as we tried to obey the leader's instructions. Sometimes they shouted orders or prodded people with their sticks to make them stand in a straighter line. The leader told us to count off by household. The count process began, quickly down the line. Ichi, ni, san, shi, go. It was Mrs. An's turn. She was 6th in line, and as the only member of her household, she had to shout the number herself. We were standing right next to her, and she looked at us in a terrible panic. All at once, I realized what was wrong. Mrs. An couldn't speak Japanese. She didn't know how to say 6 in Japanese. The rhythm of the count was broken. The silence seemed to last forever. I tried to help her. Roku, I whispered, but I didn't raise my voice. I was afraid of the other soldiers, and she didn't hear me. Finally, she yelled, Yosat, and I gasped in horror. Beside me, I felt Amoni stiffen. The whole line of people seemed to ripple in surprise. Yosat was the word for 6 in Korean. At once, a soldier strolled forward and pulled her out of the line. What did you say, old woman? Mrs. An fell to her knees. I knew she couldn't understand the soldier's word, but the anger in his voice was unmistakable. I am sorry, honorable sir. I did not know. Her speaking Korean made the soldier even angrier. Stupid cow, he yelled. What kind of dung is your brain made of? Japanese has been the official language of this country for 30 years now. How could you not know? Then he hit her with his stick on her head and shoulders. I was standing so close I could hear the thunk of the wood as it met her flesh and the sharper crack against her skull. She fell over and lay senseless. Roku, you stupid cow, Roku! He taunted her limp body. Then he looked at Amoni. Continue. Amoni took a deep breath and shouted, Sinchi. Then she began to step out of line to help Mrs. An, who was already regaining her senses. It seemed that the blows hadn't actually knocked her out. She'd simply fainted from fear and pain. But she was bruised and dazed and needed help. As Amoni knelt in the street, the soldier turned toward us. You there, what are you doing? Amoni bowed her head and spoke in a meek voice. I am sure the honorable sir is a man who respects his elders. Mrs. An is a senior to me. It's my duty to assist her. I was paralyzed with fear. Amoni's voice seemed timid, but her words were like iron. I'd never heard her speak like that to a man before. How could she speak to a soldier this way? Would he beat her too? The soldier's mouth and eyes narrowed as he looked at her for a moment. Then he made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Get her out of the way," he snarled. Amoni and I took Mrs. An to her home. I made tea while Amoni took care of her wounds. My hand shook so much that I spilled tea all over the table. But when Amoni saw the mess I'd made, she didn't scold me. She put her hand on my shoulder and pressed down gently, as if she were trying to stop my trembling. It worked. I reached up and touched her hand and felt a little better. After a few days, when Mrs. An was fully recovered, Amoni sent me to her house to teach her to count in Japanese. I went without complaining because I felt so guilty that I hadn't helped her in the line. If I'd been braver, if I'd said Roku loud enough for her to hear, maybe she wouldn't have been beaten. When I arrived, she invited me in. I sat on the floor and she served tea. I sipped at mine silently. After a few minutes, she put down her cup and looked at me. "You will teach me to count?" she said. "Yes, Ajama." "Good, let us begin." I said the words as I held up the correct number of fingers. This was how the teacher had taught the class when I first started school. I had already been able to count Japanese because of my friendship with Tomo. "Ichi, ni, si, shan, go," I said, and paused. Then Mrs. An echoed the words slowly. Then I went on, "Roko, sinchi." She shook her head and stopped me. "No," she said, "to 5 again." She seemed she'd rather learn the first 5 very well before going on. Maybe that was a good idea. "Ichi, ni, si, shan, go," I said. We did this a few more times. Then Mrs. An said, "Every student gets 1. Then the teacher announced there won't be any more classes that day. Oops. She said the numbers by herself. After she'd done it 3 times in a row without a mistake, she sat back. "That will do," she said and smiled. "You are a good teacher. Tell your mother that I said you needn't come back anymore." I bowed my head, puzzled. I didn't want to contradict her yet. I felt I had something to say. "But Ajama, you have only learned to count to 5. Surely we should continue to 10. There were 10 households in our association. She would need to be able to count at least that high. "No," Mrs. An's voice rang out strongly. I looked at her, surprised. "No," she said again. She lowered her voice a little. "I will tell you why. I have nothing in this world. You know that. Everyone knows that. No children, no family, alone here all day with nothing but my thoughts." Her voice was still fierce as she continued. "They cannot have my thoughts. I will not allow it." She held up her hand. "Ichi, ni, si, shan, go," she said finger by finger. 1 hand, 5 fingers of thought. That is all I will give them, not one more. I rose to leave. At the door, I turned and bowed deeply to Mrs. An. She seemed surprised and pleased by this, and nodded at me kindly. At home, I told Amoni what had happened at Mrs. An's house. She said nothing for a few moments. Then she looked at me steadily, put her hands on my shoulders. "Sunhee, it will be our job, yours and mine, to fetch Mrs. An quickly whenever there is a neighborhood accounting," she said. "As soon as you hear the megaphone, one of us must be out the door, quick as a cat. If I'm delayed, you must go yourself. Is this clear?" I frowned. Mrs. An was elderly, but she could still get around quite well by herself. "Sunhee, do you understand? One of us must go quickly every time." And suddenly I did understand. I looked at Amoni and I nodded. She gripped my shoulders firmly, then gave me a hug. Yes, we'd have to be quick to make sure that Mrs. An would always be one of the first 5 households in line.